Nada Huranieh was the kind of mother who held her family together with quiet strength. But on a summer morning in 2015, her lifeless body was found at the bottom of her staircase, and the only people inside the house were her 3 children. Within weeks, her teenage son was arrested for her murder, and what unraveled next was a chilling tale of betrayal, hidden rage, and a family's darkest secret. Nada Huranieh was known in her community as a warm, elegant woman who put her family first. She lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Sandy, Utah, where nothing much ever happened. To her neighbors, she was a devoted mother of 3, always seen driving her children to school, volunteering at events, and keeping to herself. On the surface, her life appeared stable and peaceful, one centered around home and family. But behind the walls of her well-kept house, cracks had begun to form. Few people knew that Nada was going through a bitter divorce. Her marriage had been slowly unraveling for years, and tensions inside the household had become more pronounced in recent months. Nada had tried to keep things civil for the sake of her children, but there were whispers among friends that the situation had grown more strained than she let on. Custody battles and financial disagreements had turned the separation into a drawn-out conflict. There were even hints that the emotional environment inside the house had become toxic. Still, no one could have predicted what was about to happen. On the morning of August 1st, 2015, a call was placed to 911. Nada had been found unresponsive at the bottom of her staircase. Paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. She was declared dead at the scene. At first, it seemed like a terrible accident, an early morning fall down the stairs. But something didn't feel right. Her injuries didn't match what one would expect from such a fall. The bruising was minimal. Her neck showed signs of trauma. There were no defensive wounds, but there was an unsettling stillness to the entire scene. Investigators began to question the circumstances surrounding her death. The house was oddly quiet, too clean, almost staged. There was no sign of forced entry, no clear sign of struggle. It was the kind of scene that made seasoned detectives pause. Something was off. They started by looking at those closest to Nada, her immediate family. Her estranged husband was one of the first people they questioned. The divorce had been heated, and emotions had run high. But he had an alibi, and there was no immediate evidence tying him to the scene. Then, attention turned toward the children, especially her teenage son. He had been home that morning. He was the one who called for help. His account of what happened was vague. He claimed he woke up to find her at the bottom of the stairs, but his story had gaps, pieces that didn't fit together. As detectives examined his version of events, they began to notice small inconsistencies. Meanwhile, forensic experts combed through the house, looking for anything that might suggest foul play. What they found only deepened the mystery. Nada's injuries, especially the marks around her neck, were inconsistent with a simple fall. There were faint bruises that suggested she may have been grabbed or pushed. And then, hidden among her personal belongings, they found a journal. It was filled with private reflections, and in the final pages, Nada wrote about feeling unsafe. She believed someone close to her had started to change, becoming angry, even aggressive. She didn't name names, but her fear was clear. As the investigation progressed, the details surrounding Nada Huranieh's death grew darker and more complex. The discovery of her journal gave detectives a chilling glimpse into her final days. Her writings were filled with unease, anxiety, and a growing sense that something was very wrong within her own home. She described walking on eggshells, feeling watched, and fearing that her efforts to keep her family together had turned into a dangerous game. Her words didn't point directly at anyone, but they revealed a deep-rooted fear that something inside the house was spiraling out of control. Investigators turned their focus more sharply on the family dynamics. They began to examine not just the husband, but also the 3 children who had lived under the same roof. It was the teenage son, however, who drew the most attention. He had always been quiet, somewhat withdrawn, but teachers and acquaintances had noticed a recent change. He had grown more isolated. His temper had flared on occasion, and he had reportedly been struggling emotionally in the wake of the divorce. These were red flags, but nothing that could have predicted a violent act, at least not on the surface. Digital forensics began to paint a clearer picture. Police obtained access to devices used in the home, including the son's phone and computer. What they found was disturbing. There were internet searches about fatal injuries, specifically about falls downstairs. Search history showed visits to websites detailing how to fake an accident. These searches had been conducted just days before Nada's death. That, combined with the inconsistencies in the son's statements, shifted the case from a suspicious death to a likely homicide. The neighborhood, once quiet and trusting, was now buzzing with fear and confusion. People who had known Nada and her family were shocked. How could a tragedy like this happen in such a peaceful place? The house on Tanglewood Drive was now seen differently, not as a family home, but as a crime scene. The idea that a mother may have been murdered by her own child was almost too much to believe. But the evidence was mounting. A surveillance camera from a neighbor's home had caught footage of someone moving around outside the house in the early morning hours. Someone matching the son's build and clothing. Though the footage was grainy, it provided enough to raise further suspicion. Inside the house, more subtle clues emerged. A towel used to wipe down surfaces. A faint outline of a handprint on the stair railing. None of it was enough on its own, but together it formed a disturbing picture of premeditation and concealment. Interviews with family friends revealed even more. Some admitted that Nada had confided in them about concerns with her son's behavior. She had mentioned mood swings, outbursts, and an increasing sense of fear. But she had always tried to protect her children, never imagining the danger could come from within her own family. As investigators pieced everything together, the case began to solidify, and the realization hit hard. The person Nada feared most may have been living just down the hallway. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, authorities made the difficult decision to act. On September 18, 2015, just over 6 weeks after Nada Huranieh's death, her teenage son was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The news sent shockwaves through the community. It was a development no one could have expected, a tragic twist that turned a family's grief into a public spectacle. For many, it was still hard to comprehend. How could a boy who once clung to his mother's side be accused of ending her life? The arrest was based on a combination of digital evidence, forensic analysis, and the timeline of events. Investigators believed the death was not only intentional, but planned. The son's internet history, behavior on the morning of the incident, and his reaction during questioning all raised serious concerns. He had remained calm, almost too calm, when speaking to officers. His account of finding his mother had lacked emotion, and his details shifted each time he repeated the story. Despite the mounting evidence, the case was not straightforward. The boy was a minor, just 16 at the time. He had no criminal record, no prior violent incidents, and had been described by some teachers and peers as intelligent and quiet. This created a difficult challenge for prosecutors. They had to prove that the crime was deliberate, that he had acted with intent, and that he had understood the consequences of his actions. Defense attorneys argued that if anything had happened, it was the result of emotional distress and confusion, not premeditated violence. As the case prepared to go to trial, more disturbing details came to light. Forensic specialists had determined that Nada's injuries were consistent with a forceful push from the top of the stairs. The angle and severity of the fall were not typical of an accident. There were faint marks around her neck and wrists. That suggested she may have tried to defend herself, though there was no struggle found at the scene. It appeared she had been caught off guard. Adding to the complexity was the role of Nada's estranged husband. While he was never charged in connection with the murder, questions surrounded his influence on the household. The divorce proceedings had been intense, and there were allegations that he had created a hostile environment. Some investigators quietly speculated that the son might have been under emotional pressure or manipulation. However, with no direct evidence linking the father to the crime, the focus remained solely on the teen. The public watched the case unfold with a mix of sorrow and disbelief. The idea that a child could commit such a horrific act against their own mother was unsettling. People began to look at their own lives differently. How well did anyone truly know what went on behind closed doors? The tragedy of Nada Huranieh's death was no longer just about one family. It had become a haunting reminder of how deep and hidden turmoil can sometimes explode into unthinkable violence. The trial began under intense media attention. Local news outlets followed every development, and the courtroom filled with reporters, legal experts, and members of the stunned community. Nada Huranieh's name was no longer just that of a quiet suburban mother. It had become a symbol of a mystery that gripped the entire state. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision, presenting evidence that pointed to a calculated act by her teenage son. They described a crime rooted in growing resentment, emotional instability, and possibly manipulation from the strained environment at home. They began with the timeline of the morning Nada died. Her son claimed he found her at the bottom of the stairs around 6:15 a.m. and immediately called 911. But a deeper examination of phone records showed that his phone had been active much earlier. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera revealed faint movement around the Huranieh home before dawn. Too early to match his version of events. A blurry figure, tall and slim, could be seen walking toward the house, disappearing into the shadows before the lights inside flickered on. Next came the forensic evidence. Experts testified that Nada's injuries did not match a simple fall. There was evidence of blunt force trauma, suggesting she had been pushed or struck before she fell. Small abrasions on her wrists hinted at a brief struggle. But the most compelling discovery was the towel found near the staircase, damp with water and what appeared to be diluted blood, an apparent attempt to clean up. It suggested not panic, but planning. The prosecution also introduced the contents of the son's devices. Internet searches revealed chilling phrases like, "how to cause someone to fall downstairs without being caught," and "accidental death scenarios." There were notes deleted from his phone that hinted at frustration and rage, particularly about the family situation and his mother's decisions during the divorce. It all painted a portrait of a troubled teen spiraling under emotional pressure, possibly seeking an escape in the most violent way. The defense, however, argued that the prosecution's theory was built on assumptions. They said the boy was devastated by his mother's death and confused by the chaos that followed. The searches on his devices, they claimed, were taken out of context. They suggested that the bruises could have resulted from the fall itself or an earlier, unrelated incident. They emphasized his age, his lack of a criminal background, and the psychological toll the divorce had taken on him. To them, the boy was not a cold-blooded killer, but a frightened, emotionally overwhelmed teenager caught in an unimaginable situation. Throughout the trial, the boy sat quietly, often avoiding eye contact with the jury. His expression remained blank, unreadable. Witnesses described him as emotionally distant, both before and after his mother's death. Some speculated he didn't fully grasp what had happened or what he had done, but for the jury, the evidence told a powerful story. A story not of an accident, but of an act so tragic and unexpected, it would leave a lasting scar on everyone who had known the Huranieh family. As the trial neared its end, tension in the courtroom became almost unbearable. The jury had listened to weeks of testimony, reviewed photographs of the crime scene, read through digital evidence, and watched as forensic experts laid out their findings in painstaking detail. Yet, the motive behind Nada Huranieh's death remained murky. There was no single, clear explanation, only a tangled web of emotional strain, family conflict, and psychological instability. The prosecution didn't argue that the motive was simple. They argued that the act itself spoke louder than any explanation could. In their closing statement, prosecutors reminded the jury that while the son was young, he was not unaware. He had taken calculated steps, clearing his browsing history, trying to clean the scene, offering a story with gaps he could not explain. They emphasized the cold efficiency of the act, how Nada's death appeared sudden, deliberate, and almost silent. No screams, no calls for help, just a body at the bottom of the stairs and a 911 call that came later than it should have. The defense countered with a plea for understanding. They described the teenager not as a murderer, but as a broken young boy trapped in a volatile home environment. They spoke of the psychological toll the divorce had taken, the pressure of living in a tense household, and the absence of stability. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, the conclusions speculative. They asked the jury to consider not just the facts, but the person behind them, a teenager whose life had crumbled along with his family's. After closing arguments, the jury was sent to deliberate. Hours turned into a full day, then 2. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited in the sweltering August heat, while inside, the Huranieh family sat in heavy silence. Finally, on the third day, the jury returned with a verdict. The courtroom stood still as the foreperson announced the decision. Guilty of first-degree murder. Gasps rippled through the room. Some cried. Others sat frozen. The son, now convicted, showed little emotion. He looked straight ahead, barely blinking, as the judge read out the sentencing process that would follow. Because of his age, he would be tried as a minor, but could face serious, long-term consequences. His fate was no longer in his hands. With the trial over, the community was left trying to make sense of what had happened. How could such a tragedy have grown from inside such a seemingly ordinary home? There were no easy answers. Some blamed the stress of the divorce. Others pointed to mental health issues or family dynamics that had long gone unnoticed. But no theory fully explained how a child had come to commit such a final, irreversible act. Nada Huranieh was remembered by friends as kind, patient, and deeply loving. Her loss left a hole not only in her family, but in the entire neighborhood. What remained was a story of sorrow, warning, and unanswered questions. A life lost, a family broken, and a mystery that, despite a verdict, still felt far from resolved.